Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. You're watching Business at 9, and we have some breaking news that's just coming in from the United States. Well, reportedly, President Donald Trump has told a room full of Republican lawmakers that he will fire the Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell after receiving approval from them to make the move. Reportedly, in fact, the president asked lawmakers on how they felt about firing the Fed chair, and they expressed their approval for firing the Fed chair. The president indicated that it will happen soon. In fact, on the back of that, we are seeing some moves in dollar. Dollar has tumbled as the president is mulling firing the Fed chair. Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index has also fallen 0.7%. It's been the dollar's worst day since June 24. The dollar index already was slipping. It was slipping in the past 1 month alone, and now a White House official has reportedly said that Jerome Powell could be fired soon. On the back of that, the S&P 500 index has slipped after opening in the green. In fact, it's the case with all the indices at the moment. All of these indices were seeing gains. They were in the green when the markets opened, but as of now, we're seeing all of these indices in the red, trading in the red territory as of now. The Dow Jones is down by close to 100 points. The Nasdaq is down by close to 80 points, and the S&P 500 index is down by at least 17 points. And in fact, ladies and gentlemen, to comment on this breaking story, we are given to understand that Mr. Geoff Denis, an independent markets commentator, is joining us on the phone line. Mr. Denis, your first reaction to this piece of news that's just coming in. There are reports that are indicating that the Fed chair could be fired.
I'm surprised, frankly, because I thought the general assumption was that it was not possible for the White House to fire the Federal Reserve Chairman. So that's my first reaction. It's surprise. And if, on the other hand, somehow he's managed procedurally to get to allow himself, so to speak, to fire Jerome Powell, if that's what he's going to do, that is consistent with selling of U.S. assets generally. I noticed the bond market is pretty flat, but as you said, stocks are down and the dollar is down. And I suspect what's going on here, Trump is finally losing his patience over the Fed's unwillingness to cut interest rates. And so now he's saying, look, I have no other choice, in my mind anyway, on his mind, I should say, but to fire the Fed. But I think legally it's a very, very dubious very dubious move.
Right, Mr. Denis. In fact, it remains to be seen if this is legally tenable for Donald Trump to fire the Fed chair. Of course, he's been criticizing the Fed chair since past many days. But let me ask you, how might Powell's potential firing affect financial markets and investor confidence, both in the short term and the long term? In the short term, in fact, we're seeing some correction being seen on Wall Street. How much further is it going to go down?
Well, I think, clearly we've had one particularly heavy bout of selling all U.S. assets earlier this year, which was in April, so-called Liberation Day. And you might argue that given the news that's come out, which you've captured here, you might have argued the markets would have reacted more dramatically than they have done. And this could be partly because the market's not really sure if this is truly going to happen. But if it does happen, I think, unfortunately, what's going to occur is that you'll get a much, much more pro-Trump, dovish, pro-low interest rate Fed chairman as an alternative. And I think that will generate the risk of further declines in the U.S. dollar, potentially create a lot of uncertainty for U.S. equities, both short and long term. And I think because of the concerns over the size of the U.S. debt and the U.S. deficit, and how if you start tampering the Fed's independence, which is what you're doing, it's probably eventually going to put pressure on the bond market also. So I don't think anything good comes of this, frankly. And it's not good for U.S. assets. It's good for foreign assets in relative terms compared to U.S. assets if he goes through with it. I'm still a little skeptical as to whether he will do. But if he does go through with this, it's going to be poor for U.S. assets relative to overseas assets.
Right. Right, Mr. Denis, and we'll have to see whether this is going to be a case of Taco or Trump always chickens out. Whether this is just a mere threat, or is he going to follow this soon? But in case he decides to fire him, then what's the kind of impact that you think will the Federal Reserve's monetary policy direction take and its independence, particularly with respect to the Donald Trump administration? Remember, Donald Trump just yesterday tweeted stating that he's pushing for a 3-point rate cut.
Yeah. A 3-point rate cut, frankly, would be, I think, devastating for U.S. assets, especially for the dollar, because there is no case for a 300 basis point cut. That would make real interest rates at the short end, pretty much at every maturity, would make them negative. And in an environment here where inflation is still above the Fed's 2% target, and the fiscal side is so out of control, that I think would be frankly crazy. Now, I think what would happen will depend on, if he does fire Jerome Powell, who comes in his place. Now, the names that have been put forward all seem to be very pro-Trump. Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, Kevin Hassett, the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, etc. They would be presumed to be following much more what Trump wants them to do. And what that does is it threatens the independence of the Federal Reserve going forward into the long term, into the next Fed chairman's term. And that is going to have a prolonged impact of creating uncertainty about the value of U.S. assets. Now, what could sort this out quickly is if inflation suddenly collapses to 2% and the economy's weak, and then you could argue lower interest rates are justified. But right now, they're not. And if Powell is fired and we get somebody like Scott Bessent, or as I say, Kevin Hassett or Kevin Warsh in there, and they do what Trump wants to do, it's really bad, I think, potentially over a sustained period of time for U.S. assets.
Absolutely, Mr. Denis, and the inflation numbers, they came in yesterday, and of course, inflation in the United States has shot up. There are concerns over that as well on how this is going to bode well for the U.S. economy overall. But what is the sense that you're getting in terms of this news it'll have on markets overall, at least over the next few days, given the fact that this is coming in at a time when Donald Trump's tariff-related policies have created a havoc. They've created a lot of uncertainty in global markets as well. The dollar index has also been falling, and now we're given to understand that it is this year's low that the dollar index has touched.
Yes, I think what's going to happen here is it's just going to layer one more level of uncertainty over all the uncertainty we've got already, or perhaps one should say one more layer of negative news over what we've got already. And so I think it's going to take a period of time before we know how bad this is. Now, if you were to fire Powell, what's going to happen is you get this initial knee-jerk reaction along the lines of what we're beginning to see today. Whether that follows through with further weakness depends on who he appoints and what the new appointment is, how he leads the FOMC in terms of monetary policy. Because it would be, I think, unreasonable to believe that whoever is put in as the new Fed chairman would suddenly decide, I'm going to cut interest rates by 300 basis points because President Trump says that's what should happen. That would be unprecedented. And I think what tends to often happen is when these people who are ostensibly doves get into that marble building, on Independence and Constitution Avenue, they start behaving maybe differently. So you would have to see how the new guy basically operated and how much he would be willing to cut interest rates. So you've got all this uncertainty which is being created here. It's poor for U.S. assets without any question until the situation settles down. And by the way, if the dollar is to go down on the back of this and in a more sustained manner, start behaving like it did a few weeks ago, very good in relative terms for emerging markets because, of course, they do well when the dollar's going down.
Right. Right, Mr. Denis, I'm afraid I have to interject you here because we're getting some news updates on this particular story that Trump has said that he's not planning to fire the Fed Chair Powell. And this is a point that I was making just a short while back on whether this is going to be something that he's going to follow through, or is this going to be another case of a tuck or Trump always chickens out. Seems like he's saying that he's not going to fire Fed Chair Powell. But what is your expectation of how the president is going to act, given the fact that he has flip-flopped on many of his policy directives earlier as well? So whether it was related to, issuing strikes on Iran, or whether it was related to issuing tariff letters.
I don't think you could call this technically a taco situation, so to speak, because he's not said himself he's going to fire Trump. He's going to fire, Powell. Obviously, there was this meeting on the Hill today, and a White House spokesman said he might fire Powell soon. But Trump has not said he's going to do it. He's threatened it, of course, but he's not done it. And I still, and I said this right at the beginning of our interview, I still think it's probably not as likely as it seems to be today. And therefore, maybe it's not a Trump always chickens out situation. He is cognizant of how the markets behave. And if the markets continue to be soft because they are reacting to the fear of the Fed chairman being fired, I think what that's going to do is make the Trump less likely to do it, frankly. Don't forget also, Powell's term is up next spring. And if he's not happy with monetary policy, he's only got to wait 9 months, basically, pretty much 9 months anyway. And then he can put a new chairman in anyway without the bother of firing him. And also, ultimately, depends, of course, on how the tariffs play out on the inflation rate. But Powell is probably going to cut interest rates anyway later this year. My call for a while has been 2 rate cuts. And, okay, not 300 basis points, of course, but 300 basis points is ridiculous. It's a typical stupid, silly overreaction by Trump. It really is. But interest rate cuts, modest cuts, gradual cuts, they are coming, I think, later this year. So it would behoove Trump, I think, just to be quiet and wait for these events, because he can replace Powell, in 9 months' time anyway.
Right. Right. Mr. Denis, in fact, we were just talking about the fact that the dollar has registered its worst day since June 2024. So that is going to be perhaps one of the biggest risks to Powell's firing. But what are the other risks of politicizing the Federal Reserve leadership, and how might this affect the U.S. economy in the long term?
It's not easy to model how it's going to affect the U.S. economy in the long term. But what I could certainly tell you is that the logical response would be dollar goes lower, equities go lower, bond yields go higher, although that might be cushioned a little bit because the danger is if Trump overreaches, that it might freeze up investment and slow the economy right down, and that might lead to a recession risk. But logically, if you overlay the fiscal situation on that, we get another round of selling everything in the U.S. again, like we had in April, if he does decide to fire Powell. And, one thing I was thinking about as I was, just before the interview is that the Federal Reserve may be the only part of Washington that that Trump has not been able to get what he wants. He's got what he wants from Capitol Hill, he's got what he wants from Doge, he's got what he wants through all of these executive actions that he's not been able to control.
Right, sir.
And I think what he's doing now is
right, sir, and remains to be seen whether... Right. Right, sir. And remains to be seen whether he's going to fire the Fed chair or not. As of now, Donald Trump is reportedly stating that the incidence of that happening is highly unlikely. Thank you very much, Mr. Denis, for joining us on this big breaking story on ET Now. Thank you very much for taking the time out. Meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, let me quote Donald Trump once again, according to what reports are suggesting. He said that, quote unquote, he's not planning on doing anything to remove Jerome Powell after a White House official reportedly said that the president was likely to seek an approval for the ouster of Fed Reserve's chair soon. Meanwhile, it's time now for us to shift tracks completely. It remains to be seen whether that's going to happen or not, and the kind of ramification that it's going to have, on the politicization of the Fed leadership, and of course on the rate cut trajectory, the rate decision trajectory that the United States is going to follow. But some